How's it going?
It's going good, going good. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, of course, of course. Yeah, the other fellow absolutely loved it. Not what I was expecting, but in a good way. So,
Yeah, we get that a lot. I think people have it sounds like a gimmick, and we kind of get through all of the gimmick stuff you might expect in the first 10 minutes. And then hopefully you kind of have no idea where it's going to go. And then it does go, I think, to some pretty surprising places.
yeah, definitely surprising, but awesome at the same time. So,
Thank you.
how did you come up with this idea?
So, I mean, I tried to track the genesis of it. I'm not really much of a brainstormer. It did just sort of come to me one day. But I think a couple of elements. One, I'm a James Bond fan. And secondly, it was actually, do you remember kind of earlier in Facebook, there'd often be these kind of wild Facebook, just dumb Facebook groups people make. And I was a member of a Facebook group of everyone who had my name, and it was all the other Matthew Bowers. And we would talk about really innocuous stuff like who's got Matt Bauer at Gmail, who's got Matthew Bauer at Gmail, and that kind of thing. And I think somewhere in there came the idea to type James Bond into the Facebook search. And yeah, I found some of these real James Bonds out there, and I sent them a kind of spam email saying, "Hey, I'm thinking of maybe there might be a documentary in this. Have you guys got anything, interesting?" And I think, as our audience is expecting a lot of Aston Martin jokes and that sort of thing, but they came back very quickly with a lot of the stories you see in the film that had surprising things to say about, especially like identity, sort of like, masculine identity and racial identity and like sexual identity. And also stuff that had a surprising amount of like drama to it. Suddenly I was hearing stories about the Second World War and being on the run from the police and being on the run from stalkers. And there was a lot of stuff in there that I wasn't expecting. And quite quickly, it became a good idea to, yeah, go and make the film.
That's awesome. Um, did you try out any other like famous names before settling on James Bond, or did you always know that nope, James Bond was it?
No, it was always James Bond. The thing is, there isn't like another name in pop culture, at least, that carries the same kind of like masculine weight on a man's shoulders. I think being called Luke Skywalker, I don't think quite has the same sort of thing, because James Bond, at least in the 20th century, was very much the symbol of like kind of like alpha kind of masculinity, very sort of duty-free shop version of masculinity. I mean, with James Bond, you know what car he drives, what women he's interested in, what cigarettes he smokes, what he drinks. You know so much about James Bond in a way that you don't really know much about, say, like Luke Skywalker as a person in quite the same way. So I think it's only this name. There is actually another documentary out there which is about men who are called Adolf Hitler. And even though it's a completely kind of different place to where we are, I can understand how that makes a film, because it's a name obviously outside of pop culture, but that does have the same kind of name recognition, for the wrong reasons, but has the same sort of name recognition, and also has kind of a weight of history to it in the way that James Bond does. But yeah, I think it needs to be a pretty well-known name for something like this to work.
That makes sense for sure. So, how many James Bonds did you actually talk to?
Look, I probably spoke to about 100 or so, in the end. Yeah, I sent out a lot of messages which never got responses to them. And I found out actually it's because a lot of these guys, they receive things from people other than me all the time. They do receive a lot of like their local newspaper wants to do a story on the James Bond, or a lot of like when the Bond films are coming out, a lot of like marketers and stuff decide to try and get a real James Bond to kind of promote their product as well. Some of them also, it sounds funny, but some of them also get messages from kind of like mentally ill people who are trying to contact James Bond, if that makes sense. Like definitely back in England, like the Queen and the royal family kind of have this a lot, as as these quite well-known people. And so some of our James Bonds as well kind of get some very kind of strange messages sometimes as well. I spoke with about 100 of them, and yeah, of that we kind of filmed at that stage about kind of 7 of them who we thought would kind of work well, kind of fitting into a film together. And then actually about funnily enough, most of the characters you see in the film who are like the main primary characters, they are ones who came after that initial search for one reason or another. One is the Swedish James Bond, who is a Swedish James Bond super fan who's turned himself into James Bond. Found him after we started because a James Bond fan, told us about him. And then there is a James Bond in Indiana who was arrested for murder. And that happened during our shoot. And so obviously that came up. And then I have to avoid spoilers, but the film does have a surprise central character who you're probably not expecting in this Men Named James Bond film. And they came about because it turned out that it was best to tell that story through that character rather than the James Bond that's in that story.
Interesting. The ones that ultimately agreed to participate, was it difficult getting them on board considering all of the other emails and messages that they get?
No, it wasn't. I mean, it's somewhat geographical. Here in America, when you ask people to be on TV, they say yes. There's documentarian. That's very, that's very handy. But people they're almost like it's their civic responsibility they're doing. They're like, of course I'll do your documentary. But I think there's something also to the fact that I was making a feature film. These guys have been like haunted by a character who is in feature films. So whilst they might not be interested in doing a TV commercial for a casino or something that's going to essentially kind of make fun of them, I think that they admired that I was kind of willing to go the distance and make a feature film about them and kind of really take this very unique, it's not a mental health problem, but this very kind of unique psychological space that these guys exist in, and treat it really seriously and kind of do a full movie on it. So yeah, I think they're generally happy that they've kind of got their own Bond movie now that they're starring in.
Yeah. How long did this process take? Like from finding the bonds to the finished product?
Yeah, we shot from the premiere of Skyfall until the premiere of No Time to Die, which is kind of 3 Bond films. And the reason for that is when your name is James Bond, James Bond is always existing in the media space around my characters, but it goes in ebbs and flows. And obviously that period where a Bond film is coming out tends to be that kind of peak. And so even though we did kind of shoot on and off a bunch of different things, we were really kind of at go time when the Bond films were coming out. And oddly, those 3 films, they kind of gave us a bit of a spine to kind of work from as a story structure, kind of opening the film with Skyfall and closing with No Time to Die, which happened to end up being the end of Daniel Craig's kind of reign as James Bond. And especially when, the idea of a new James Bond and who's that's going to be coming out, that kind of gave us kind of a bit of a spine to the film.
Cool. Did you need to get approval from the production companies of the James Bond movies to do your work, or are you completely separate?
No, we're completely separate. I mean, there's no clips from the James Bond films or anything in our story. And what we realized quite quickly, right? So what gets to my characters is actually not the plot of Skyfall, or Goldfinger or something like that. These guys aren't sitting around watching the James Bond films being like, how dare you do this to me? Where you hear James Bond in the media is just literally everywhere. And you'll see in the film, there's these kind of screens that hover above the cities they're sitting in. And that was me trying to kind of convey these guys' mental space, that they always have this noise of James Bond information always sort of above them. And, that information isn't scenes from the Bond films. It's CNN and like that kind of thing. And now that I've known these guys for a while, I'm more attuned to it as well. And actually, you hear about James Bond every day if you're just around. I'm a big Below Deck fan, and like, trust me, watch out for it. They talk about James Bond about once every Below Deck episode, and it's something I've noticed in recent years. They use it as a verb. You know what I mean? Oh, that boat is very James Bond, or one of them will wear a tuxedo, and it's like, oh, good evening, Mr. Bond, or something like that. And so that for me was the kind of thing that they're having to deal with, and so that didn't require clips from a Bond film or anything like that. There is in the end a lot of kind of like archival stuff that features Daniel Craig, especially in the film, but not him in the Bond films themselves.
Gotcha. Um, what was something that these James Bonds have to go through that really surprised you as you were going through this process?
Yeah, the biggest surprise actually sort of came in editing. With these things, you end up doing, 30, 40 hours of interviews kind of thing. And I kind of clocked it as we were filming, but many of them told me the exact same story. And it's what happens when you have encounters with the police as James Bond. And more to the point, it's why, if your name is James Bond, you carry ID on you at all times. And the reason for that is if you do have an encounter with the police, which, all of us, whether we're criminals or not, have every few years, whether it's a traffic stop or something like that. If you say, if they ask you, for your driver's license or whatever, and you say, I don't have it, the next question is, okay, tell me your name. And if you respond James Bond, you're going to end up getting arrested because they're going to think that you're kind of screwing with them. And one of our characters actually ended up in prison for 60 days because of one of these incidences. Because in the end, the judge kind of said that he was getting like aggressive and antagonizing the police officer during the altercation that sort of ensued. And that applied to, whether they were black or white or, one of our characters in England told us this story. It's very common for all of them. And that's what I didn't expect, in the sense that these guys have had this stuff happen to them so many times that they also plan 3 chess moves ahead to prevent a James Bond related problem that they know will inevitably happen in the future. And I think that's very specific to a James Bond.
Yeah, that's crazy. How did the title The Other Fellow come to be?
So in the 1969 Bond film, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, George Lazenby was this like unknown Australian model who they'd cast as James Bond. And significantly, he was the first person to ever play James Bond except Sean Connery, who was probably the most recognizable film star in the world at the time. And in the opening scene of the film, he saves the girl, but rather than her kissing him, she actually runs away and drives off. And he turns to the camera and says, "This never happened to the other fellow." And what he's referring to is the other James Bond, Sean Connery, who is much more famous than this new James Bond is. And my guys are in the exact same situation. They are dwarfed by a more famous James Bond and living in their shadows. So it seemed like kind of the obvious title to go with as a Bond reference. But I also like that it has almost like a Hitchcockian tone to it. Do you know what I mean? Like something like, the Wrong Man or that kind of thing. Yeah. And I think as well, we wanted this film to stand on its own. It's its own thing, this movie. It's not a DVD extra or something like that. And we thought it was a title that really kind of let it sort of stand on its own, rather than calling the film, I don't know, the Lives of Real Men Named James Bond or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, that doesn't quite roll off the tongue as well.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's been a slight struggle for us in the sense that, our tagline then is a film about real men named James Bond. And I think certain audiences, obviously, who aren't going to get the reference, that they do need the tagline to sort of get them over the line of seeing what the film is about.
Yeah. Do you think your documentary is going to make things a little bit easier for everyone who's named James Bond?
It absolutely has, yeah. That they've all kind of become friends through the making of it, and specifically, here in New York, we have a homosexual James Bond who we chose for obvious reasons, because obviously there's a conflict that happens when you're a homosexual who has the same name as the world's most famous womanizer. Um, and he in the film, at least in his first section, is really kind of struggling with it. And then at the end, he actually said to us, actually doing this documentary has made this so much easier for me, because I finally have these other James Bonds who I can talk to, and it's other people that get it. And that's universal. I mean, that's why you have, support groups and those kind of things that exist, so that, people who've got these often quite rare and isolating either kind of physical or mental conditions can meet someone else who has the same thing and kind of get some solace from that. And so actually at the end of the film, we do set up a kind of James Bond anonymous sort of meeting with all of them. But yeah, they've really enjoyed it. And a lot of them have become like quite good friends, through this process. And I think it's been good for them. What I find funny though is when they meet each other, they say the same annoying things to each other that someone else would, So when they meet each other, they say to each other, "So do you drive an Aston Martin?" And while they said, "I hate when people ask me that," but then they meet a James Bond and they do the same thing. And I found that really funny as well.
That is, yeah, definitely wouldn't expect that from people who hate those questions.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, so for future projects, are you planning on staying in the like what's in a name type
No,
of
no, no.
category?
No, it's just this film. It's not a subgenre. If Netflix wants to send me $1 million to produce some spin-off, I'll happily do that. But in terms of directing, no. And again, I was saying at the start, the Bond name is a specific thing. Someone asked me the other day of like, "Oh, you could make a film about people named Lara Croft," and it's like, well, what do you know about Lara Croft? Like, she raids tombs. She has large breasts. Like there's not much you can really kind of work with there. There's no kind of character that literally everyone around the world has so much kind of knowledge about. One of the characters in my film is a British army officer serving in Iraq, and he comments that, everyone here knows who James Bond is, and most of them don't even have a TV. It's only kind of Bond that's that ubiquitous. And I think with this film, the kind of gimmicky side of it didn't really interest me that much. What interested me is how having the most ubiquitous name in the world causes a lot of kind of identity confusion and like plot complications and stuff that works quite well, in the cinema. So for instance, in this film, we have when the African-American guy is arrested for murder, it gets all on the news. And of course, it becomes the top news story because James Bond arrested for murder is really good clickbait. But what he doesn't realize is actually there's another guy in the same town who's also called James Bond. And this guy happens to be a MAGA hat wearing Christian gun nut. And so, of course, when everyone hears James Bond arrested for murder, they assume it's the gun nut. And then that causes him a lot of problems. And it's those kind of things that I found really kind of interesting and gave me a lot to work with here as a filmmaker. As opposed to like, you can't get too far on like, oh, someone has a funny name. It's the things that happen to them because of it that are really interesting for me.
For sure. Yeah, it was just the way that story played out, because there wasn't a photo with the news either. So it was like, oh, and then to find out that they're in the same town, that's just who'da thunk.
Yeah, no, and look, there's James Bonds everywhere. According to our New York James Bond, because he knows stuff quite. There are actually 9 of them here in New York City. I don't know who the other 8 of them are, but yes, apparently they are around. These people. And as I make this film, all the time, people say to me, "Oh no, I used to work with a James Bond," or "I know a James Bond," or even outside that, everyone does kind of know someone who has a famous name, and everyone as well has had that thing where they receive an email to the wrong person who has their name and that kind of thing. And I think it brings up for people not so much that, oh, fun, it's a famous name, but more like where they've experienced a complication because of theirs as well, or there's someone who has one different letter in their email address or something, and those kind of things I think do happen for people a lot as well.
Yeah. It's crazy to think about it. Like just how like something as simple as a name can cause so many problems.
Well, I don't think we think about it enough. I mean, I think in our culture today, when we look at things like identity, we focus on a lot of things like kind of skin color or gender, sexuality, like all of these other kind of things. And I think we often don't stop to think that this title we've been given by our parents, that we introduce ourselves as multiple times a day, what effect that has. I mean, when Ian Fleming was choosing the name James Bond, he said he wanted just a really flat, quiet, simple name. And James Bond is that, and it has certain kind of quality. It's an ageless name, for instance. And so these things, whereas, if you have a name that has, a bunch of syllables in it and that kind of thing, it can be harder for people to pronounce, remember all these kind of things. And there are things that happen because of the material or whatever of our name.
So if you're kind of going away from the name game type of documentaries, what are you thinking of doing next?
I am making a film about the world's #1 drug problem, which is a drug called ethanol, which is the drug that is in alcoholic beverages, which of course makes it the #1 consumed drug around the world. And I think it's amazing when you look up drug documentaries. There's 200 on cocaine because that's all sexy, but I find it odd there isn't that documentary out there. Alcohol kills as many people every year as the coronavirus did, but I don't think we refer to it enough as an epidemic, as it should be. So yeah, I'm making the kind of the cowspiracy of ethanol, I'd put it that way.
Awesome. Yeah, you're right. Like it's just kind of like no one talks about it in the same way that they talk about other drugs.
It's odd. Yeah. It's it's odd is we've been conditioned to do it. So hopefully this film can help uncondition that a little bit.
Nice. All right. Well, that was all the questions that I have for you. But before I let you go, is there anything else that you'd like to add about the other fellow?
No, well, I will add, yes, you can see the film 1 week from now on Friday the 17th. It is in selected theaters, but also on demand. And it is available for pre-order now on Apple TV and iTunes. I don't know when this is going out, but it's actually on sale till Sunday at midnight for $6.99 versus $12.99. This is the used car salesman part of my job. But yes, after that it's $12.99. But yes, it's up for pre-order now, and then it will be available from next Friday.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thank you so much for chatting. Again, I loved the documentary and I'm looking forward to your next one.
Yeah. Thank you for taking the time to watch it. It's much appreciated.